Warning! Warning! This podcast contains spoilers.
Listen at your own risk.
Welcome to Medium Shift, the podcast that investigates how stories stack up from medium to medium through the adaptation process.
This episode, we investigate the relationship between a vampire and a human. Don't worry, it's not Twilight.
Welcome to Medium Shift. I'm Chris.
And I'm Ev.
And this episode, we're going to be doing the 2010 American remake, Let Me In. Remade based on the Swedish 2008 film, Let the Right One In, based on a 2004 book called Let the Right One In.
Ooh, double adaptation.
Yes, it's very exciting. So, what did you think of Let Me In?
I thought it was novel.
Novel?
Novel, yeah.
I get it.
No,
I get
that's not what I meant.
it.
I regret my choices immediately. It's a really interesting concept. I do like it, and I like that they're going back to that traditional vampire with all the rules and stuff. Really sort of not shying away from like all these potential missteps and potential like roadblocks.
It's very classic vampirism from like Dracula, like that sort of age. Yeah.
And the name Let Me In coming from the fact that vampires have to be let in verbally into a house if it is owned by someone.
Yeah, which is thematically and like plot-wise appropriate in a lot of ways. Yeah.
And so I found it did plod along at times. I do find, and some of the issues, while I do see artistically what they were doing, some of the stuff they did was brilliant artistically and fit the story perfectly, but kind of ruined the experience.
Like what exactly? Like what examples are we talking?
The first thing, and I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit to differences, but the American remake, Let Me In, is a lot darker than Let the Right One In, and I mean that in the literal sense. Their lighting for Let Me In was really off. It felt great. Really? I felt in that it almost followed the story. It like as the Owen his life started taking it better, and after he met up with Abby and all that, it got a bit lighter, and then the darker moments it got dark. But there are times where I'm like, okay, I'm just watching a black and orange film, aren't I? And like, okay, he's talking to someone, can't quite make that out.
Interesting.
Whereas the 2008 one kept a bit more consistent with the lighting, and I could actually see people.
Sure.
And the snow looked like snow.
You feel well. There is a little bit of that fake snow. Yeah. Yes. So, what you thought, like Let Me In, was maybe a little bit too stylized or something like that, perhaps, or
I think I could, from an artistic point, I love what they were doing, but from just an average cinema goer point of view, kind of felt like a little harder to watch at times.
Sure.
Like it wasn't something I could just sort of sit back and be engrossed by it. I had to keep an eye on everything at all times.
Okay. Yeah, no, fair enough. Interesting. Well, for me personally, this episode I'm actually quite excited for, because as the film purist of the two of us, as one might say, I am just very keen on talking about this gorgeous Swedish horror film that I saw for the first time maybe a couple of years ago. Which just led me to watching this movie with a very specific lens. So just, general background and Let the Right One In. I saw it for the first time a couple of years ago. I love it. I think it's a really great movie, and I'm sure we'll get into that at some point. And so the moment I heard there was an American adaptation of that only came out a few years afterwards, every single alarm bell in my head started ringing. Like, that is the textbook example of so many things going wrong and trying to Americanize this beautiful story and changing the themes and just taking it in the wrong direction in so many respects. But I think this movie is great, and I was genuinely surprised by that. Like, I think a lot of it stems from the choice of director. Like, Matt Reeves, I think, is a really, really solid contemporary Hollywood director who's not only incredibly thoughtful with his direction, but also thematically driven, which I think is incredibly appropriate to this story. And so not only does it remain faithful and almost scene for scene, like appropriate to the original, but it maintains a lot of the themes of the original and in many ways improves on the themes. Like, this is an interesting adaptation in that a lot of the plot details don't change, but a lot of the way that sort of the motifs and the ideals are just conveyed a little bit differently to make them even more effective. I actually think Let Me In a lot of ways conveys some of the ideas that the first film and the book touch on in more interesting ways, which I think makes for a really interesting adaptation. I don't think it's quite as strong as the original in some ways. So I think the romance was a little bit not quite as palpable for me. That might have something to do with the fact that I'm familiar with both actors and with the Swedish actors. I haven't seen them in anything else, and I don't know if I ever will. But at the same time, I was very, not only pleasantly surprised with this, but also just legitimately impressed by how well this was adapted. So it's great.
So I do completely understand. I think the direction in this movie really was top notch. Some great work by Reeves there.
Have you seen some of Reeves' other films, or?
I think I have, but as soon as, like, as always, what happens, as soon as you try and think of something, my brain just clears out.
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
just like, no, he's made nothing else but this movie. This is all, the only thing you can think of is this movie. I'm like, damn it.
Yeah, no, for people who are unfamiliar, Matt Reeves is probably most well known right now for the Planet of the Apes remake. So he directed Dawn and War of the Planet of the Apes, and I believe wrote both of them as well. And I think Dawn is a fantastic movie, and I think War is really great too. And he's currently actually the director pegged to write and direct the new Batman film, which is obviously going to be his most big profile thing today, and I think he's a fantastic choice. And this movie just illustrates even further that he has just not only a really great attention to detail, but he's also just a story first guy. Also very clearly based on the fact that he's a screenwriter as well as a director in that way. Like he completely wrote the screenplay of this, obviously based on the the previous film's screenplay, but you can tell that he's not only reverential to it, but also incredibly faithful and does a really good job adapting it. I think he's great. Yeah.
It's all starting to sort of flow back to me, but he also did Cloverfield, didn't he?
He did do Cloverfield, yeah.
Which
I feel a little bit less strongly about that. I don't think he wrote that one.
No, it was just director, if I'm pretty
Yes,
sure.
just director. And
But
I think
I
that
can
shows.
kind of, in that very sort of similar style and very much playing with the production elements in a way that fit the story.
Yeah, sure. Talk about a
is
dark film. A dark, messy, difficult to follow film. That is Cloverfield.
Yes. Oh, that was a lot messier than this. This, at least, I can follow everything. It had to have my full attention. Although that's nothing to be sort of frowned upon.
Yeah, sure.
It just means if you miss one bit, you're a little thrown out on the deep end.
Yep.
But yes, his direction is spot on.
Yeah. So just it's a very specific approach of viewership. We have to take things in detail. But yeah, Cloverfield I don't feel as strongly about regarding Matt Reeves, but I think the direction is good, but I think it's just a little bit let down on the story. And the story respect in a couple of ways. But Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is one of my favorite blockbuster films of the last maybe 10, 20 years, easy. I think that movie is an incredible mix of spectacle and emotion and pathos and story and whatever else. And I think this movie works in a similar way, with obviously not being spectacle level, but just being an incredibly well-constructed and well-told, touching story. It's great. How exactly do you feel about the original film then? So you watched the original film after you watched the remake, did you? Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting perspective, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, I was trying to go into this, because I hadn't seen either of these before we announced it last episode as what we were going to be watching. I'm like, oh, okay, I've got to do some catching up, clearly.
Sure.
So I decided, given that Let Me In was our main focus, I'd start with that. And that sort of led me in. And when I...
It sort of let you in? Yep. Was that intentional?
No.
Man, you're on fire right now.
I'm trying not to be. I'm dousing myself as much as I can.
Yeah, okay, continue.
But yeah, and so then coming into Let the Right One In, there was a lot of stuff where I was like, okay, that's very much clearly that, that's very much clearly that. So it was the differences between the two that really stood out, because it was incredible. Like, the two are very faithful to one another and what they do is the same.
Sure.
And so it was the stuff that was different was quite interesting.
It made it more pronounced.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my thoughts on Let the Right One In essentially come down to, it's about the same.
Sure.
The stuff that was different enough that I could care about it, and the stuff that was the same was the same. So my opinion did not change.
Yeah, sure. No,
So,
I kind of get that. No, fair enough. Interesting. Okay, do we want to start moving into the sources then? A little bit of a interesting comparison?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if we're going to talk very broadly, we obviously have to talk about the book, but not only the book, about the notions of vampires as well. And that, so the original novel, Let the Right One In, of which I've read excerpts of, I will admit I haven't read all of it. It's definitely on my list at some point, but I read enough, obviously, in research for this, for plot points, looking at differences. But that came out at a time in 2004, actually from an author in his the first book he'd actually written, but also from an author who did not like vampires. He's gone on the record. I don't quite remember the name of the author right now. That's right, John Ajvide Lindqvist.
So John, Swedish name.
Yeah, let's just call him John.
Yes.
Yep.
So John.
Author John, yes. Author John, and actually the director of the film as well, a 2008 film, has come on record saying that they do not like vampires, which I think actually lent a lot to the story, because as you sort of talked about before, Let the Right One In goes back to a lot of the original, like, classic tropes of vampirism, but it's completely missing, like, say, the romanticism and sort of the more, shall we say... I don't really know what the best word is for it. Kind of like modern illusion, like sort of the modern interpretations of vampirism these days. Like you think of like Twilight. Twilight especially is like a really significant pop culture example of vampires as being idolized as this really romanticized, my skin like sparkles in daylight and we live for forever and look forever young. And it's almost like...
And we're vegetarians and somehow.
Yeah, exactly. And it moves away from vampires being these like holy creatures of the night, embodying people's fears and everything, because that's what like mythological creatures are in a lot of ways. Okay. They're sort of like
they're the removal of humanity from a human in various different ways and become the personification of other fears.
Yeah, exactly. They're a manifestation of like unconscious, like general human fear and emotion and such. But contemporary vampires has moved away from that curse into more of it being kind of a blessing, of that you live forever and your skin is nice and pretty and sparkly, and that you know whatever else. It's a highly romanticized approach to the mythology at the very least. But Let the Right One In brings it back to not only the horror of the fact that vampirism is absolutely a curse, but also just the genuine terror that is affiliated with Dracula as Dracula as we know him. As that, obviously Dracula is a horror story, and he is a horrifying creature of the night that kills a bunch of people, and this is embodied in the book and the film in the same way. So
and also the relationship with vampires and humans, especially like they as tools. Humans are essentially tools and vassals.
Yeah, they are familiars.
Familiars, which is a thing that is brought up in the original that doesn't get touched on as much. It gets up in some more traditional stuff. Like there was mentions of it in What We Do in the Shadows, another great vampire.
Yes, everyone should watch What We Do in the Shadows.
Yes, and also very traditional vampires in that. But a lot of the other things, like you mentioned, like Twilight and all these others, the human relationship is very much more sort of equal.
Romanticized, once again.
Very romanticized. Whereas this, it is very raw, and it's a romance, but you don't know how much of it is actually romantic and how much of it is almost a subconscious need for the other one, for other more primal feelings and... sure. I mean, like, the implication, especially in the book and the films and such, is that do we want to use the English names or do we want to go for the Swedish names? Well, Let Me In is the focus, so I think we'll continue with the English ones.
So it was Abby and... Owen, that's right. Yeah, so basically the implication is that Owen is eventually attracted to Abby because she represents the notion of a predator. Because, he's constantly being, like, demeaned by the boys in school and therefore, like, puts on the mask and he's trying to appear more dominant and basically more aggressive and such. And Abby is the perfect embodiment of that in that way. As we were talking about before, like, mythological creatures representing a manifestation of human nature. Which is why he finds her so appealing, which actually suggests that it isn't even an inherently romantic thing, but it's kind of like a subconscious need, almost, and a desire that he wants, not necessarily the vampirism, but he wants to have that level of assertiveness and power that he absolutely craves. There's even a reference to it in the film when Abby says to Owen, like, you want to kill these boys at school, right? You're the same as me. We are no different, basically. Which I think really speaks to that. I think is a really interesting conceit, considering both of these films and the books. And the book is considered like inherently romantic, but there's just a lot more relays to that romanticism, which I think is fascinating, and I think really is what makes this story succeed ultimately.
I feel it was that sort of underlying notion was a bit more touched on in the original Swedish one, I feel.
Yes.
Where it was very much like, I need to kill and you want to kill, that sort of thing. And that's what sort of... And it worked, I think, especially well with the actress who played the Swedish version of Abby.
Yes.
The character's name was Eli, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Eli. Yeah,
Eli
he was
and
actually
Oscar.
dubbed over as well with a more adult
Yes.
voice to make her appear more intimidating, which we'll get to.
Yes,
There are definitely
and-
differences. Yeah.
But I did feel she was more intimidating, not just the voice, but in her presence as well. Like, and the way she moved was a lot more sort of very much, this is something of out of this world. This is not someone on the same level as Oscar in this case.
Sure. Well, you don't feel that quite as much with Chloe Grace Moretz, which is actually something I feel like they were even aware of in the film, because like one of the differences between those two characters is that when Abby, Chloe Grace Moretz, kill people, like her face changes. Like when she gets more vampiric, like the skin peels back and she starts to shrivel a little bit and the teeth come out and everything like that, which doesn't happen in the original film, which is almost like they were kind of trying to compensate for the fact that Chloe Grace Moretz doesn't feel as intimidating or as otherworldly as the original actress did, which I think is, in some respects, a little bit of a flaw of the original. Chloe Grace Moretz is actually maybe one of my least favorite parts of the remake in regarding things that have changed, but we'll get to that a little bit. It's a little bit tied up into thematics, but yeah, you make a really great point in that. So, which is ultimately like, I think that's a lot of the stuff that led to the success of the book when it initially came out. So the book came out in 2004. The movie was 4 years afterwards, and it went into production almost immediately after the book came out. I read an anecdote, something along the lines of when the director called up to basically ask if he could adapt the film, he was on a waiting list of like 70 different people or something like that. Yeah, like it was very much sought after. But ultimately, he was the one he went with because they had a similar mindset regarding vampires and the way the story should be told. And that kind of led into how, like, funnily enough, the 2008 film was fairly faithful to the original because it's actually written by the screenwriter is the same author of the original, author John.
Yeah.
So yeah, which is what which I think is another really interesting thing regarding adaptations, because a lot of the time we've talked about a new creative team coming in and changing what has previously been done by an old creative team. But in this, there's a little bit of overlap between the two of them. I was trying to think of other examples of that happening in franchises and things like that. Like I know, say, J.K. Rowling has, obviously gone from writing the books to writing the screenplays for the new Fantastic Beasts films. Gillian Flynn is another great example who wrote Gone Girl and then wrote the screenplay for Gone Girl. Obviously, that's a fantastic example because Gone Girl is incredible. But then, in the other example of J.K. Rowling, a lot of the people aren't fans of the way she's been screenwriting.
It's always very touchy. It's almost like you're trying to mess your editing. Even if you are the artist, you're trying to edit what you've already got to try and fit some like almost perfect ideal, which can never be reached. And either you just get closer or you chop away too much of the stuff that made it good, kept its heart, I feel.
Yeah, sure.
So it's sort of that balance. Although there are times, of course, where things can be fixed for the better.
Yes, absolutely.
One of my favorite examples of that is a DC animated film called Batman Under the Red Hood.
What are they changing that?
Well, there was a lot of things that was brought up, but it was actually edited and written by the same author of the original comics.
Sure.
But because there was no need to connect it to a large universe, he felt he could fix things to make it more thematically appropriate.
Oh, sure. Yes.
But that's another episode.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting idea when the original creator has it adapt to their story to a new medium. Because I think the problem that a lot of people have, and is one of the reasons that this is fairly uncommon, it's very rare for the original writer of the book to also write the screenplay. The reason it is so uncommon is because a lot of people think they will be too slavish to the original. They won't be willing to cut things and make changes and so on and so forth. Which is obviously not the mindset you want going in, changing, a 400-page book to a 2-hour movie. We've talked about a lot of this before, but a film is obviously an incredibly different medium and needs to be streamlined and condensed and so on and so forth. But I genuinely think here that the writer, author John, just did a legitimately great job in that, of my understanding, especially reading parts of the book and the general plot synopsis and such, is that it cuts down a lot of the minor characters and superfluous subplots and things like that and focuses it really explicitly on the relationship between Abby and Owen, or in this version of it, Oscar and Eli. And I think that works incredibly well. So one of the interesting things, if we're going to talk about the differences between the book and the film, is that it makes things in the film a lot more ambiguous than it does in the book. So Hakan, which is basically her, her surrogate father, the person who goes out and kills people for blood for her and things like that, in the novel is actually a child pedophile. He was a teacher caught with child pornography and was kicked out for that very reason. And basically, their relationship in the book went along the time that Eli pays him to go out and get blood for her, but he's basically willing to do it for free if she sleeps with him, essentially. So that's one of those things that they obviously completely left out of the film, maybe for good taste reasons as well, but like they genuinely don't really touch on their relationship at all beyond just, you know, a couple of gestures and things like that. Like it's left a lot more ambiguous than it is in the book.
Because I sort of got this is more in the Let Me In version where I first saw this, but I thought the relationship was they met when they were both young, like both around that same time, because there are the photos of what looked like him with her back in the old time.
That's something that changed for Let Me In that I was going to get into.
Okay.
Yeah, because in the original novel as well, they also reveal that Eli is 200 years old.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, so, and also, so this is a really interesting thing, especially regarding how it plays out, but in the original, it's revealed that Eli is a boy who was circumcised just before he became a vampire and is basically dressed feminine ever since, basically. You can kind of see it briefly, indirectly touched on in Let the Right One In, basically because she refutes the fact that she's not a girl. And at one point when you see her largely naked, you see a little bit of a scar around her, you know, her chest area, basically, or like higher genitals. But beyond that, like they never directly reference it, which is once again similar to how they approach a Khan in that they leave things more ambiguous. Yeah. And I think that works. But I think gender and like sort of, you know, sexuality and such is obviously an element of any romantic story. But the way they approach it, the way that element is introduced in the book and in Let the Right One In, I think is quite interesting. But what is more interesting, I think, is actually how they change it for the new film. So Let Me In, there is, as far as I could tell, no reference at all to the fact that Chloe Grace Moretz is anything but a girl. Yeah, so, like, obviously we don't see her naked to the same extent and such, but she never, like, there's still the line that she says, I'm not a girl, but they also suggest later that that's only because of the fact that she's a vampire and such. And also coded as well, like we talked about this before, but Eli has a much more intimidating and unnerving and androgynous presence and appearance, which Chloe Grace Moretz does not have. She appears definitively female, and not only the way she appears, but the way she dresses. And her voice for most of the movie as well isn't dubbed over, which means she just has a normal feminine voice too, which I think was an interesting choice. I wonder if that was just one of the notions of like Americanizing it, and that audiences wouldn't accept it or find it a little bit more questionable if you know, if it was this young boy falling in love with also appears to be a boy, considering how, you know, homophobic some people may have interpreted that. You know, it's one of those things that an American producer might look at and decide to cut out just to be safe. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, I kind of find it interesting, though, that the androgyny almost sort of was, rather than outright removed, transferred over to the character of Owen.
Yes, well, I wanted to talk about that as well, actually, yeah. So one of the really small and I think really interesting changes between the two of them is that in Let the Right One In, he is abused by the bullies by being called a pig.
Yeah.
But in the new movie, he's abused by being called a girl, which I'm like, the moment he said that, I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. Because as you mentioned, it ties into sort of that change, which once again makes me think that even though that might have been a producer decision, that Matt Reeves sort of still wanted to interweave that notion into the story itself. So, yeah.
Yeah. And the thing with Owen, it's kind of, he's sort of trying to find, I feel it almost works because he's sort of changed from Oscar in the sense that he's a lot more sort of unsure of who he is. As much like with Oscar in the original one, I felt that there was a bit more sort of like you kick off straight with him, no mask, pretending to do the stabbing.
Yeah, the mask was an interesting change.
That was that, and that sort of felt to me that it was because it was sort of Owen being less sure of who he was, rather than sort of the whole dealing with Eli and Abby in that sense. That was sort of also almost a leftover of sort of the adjustments that were made, and I feel that sort of fits in better with that whole androgyny and sort of like in that sort of tamer kind of way of still looking at it. So that's basically just everything was.
I think you make a great point, and I think it goes back to why I was legitimately impressed with this adaptation, because I think it's one of those things that Matt Reeves looked at and adapted the theme incredibly well, but just in a slightly different direction. As you said, like some of the androgyny is transferred from Eli to Owen in a way that feels thematically appropriate for what we were talking about the romance before. Like Owen's whole arc is basically is that he wants to be more assertive and he doesn't want to be left in the feminized, generally victimized position.
Yeah.
So, and that, that thematic works honestly in a lot of ways better on him than it does Eli. Because I think actually in Let Me In, like the feminization of Eli and Abby feels more appropriate considering her predatory position. Like the whole idea of like predator and prey is a big part of it as well, obviously with the vampirism. But like a small defenseless little girl is considered, prey in so many respects. She isn't
And it's
considered a
shown
threat.
in the scene in both movies in which she acts as bait for someone going past to see, oh, she's clearly needs help before attacking.
Yeah, exactly. So I actually think that subtext works better with Abby being feminized compared to Eli in the original one, which she isn't. Sorry. And I think that's one of those elements that came from the book, obviously. So author John wanted to keep it the same. But yeah, I think that's just a really smart adaptation thematically that I think really works. Once again, one of the reasons I think the new adaptation is actually really good. So yeah, awesome. Oh yeah, so one of the other changes that I thought was interesting going from, even though like a lot of the subplots was cut out of the book going into the first film, there is one subplot that I remember watching the film the first time that I thought was a little bit weird, and that's the one, I don't remember the character's name in the moment. I think it's Victoria in the American version, but it's the girl who gets bitten by Abby, and then Abby gets kicked away by the boyfriend and such, and then she starts to turn into the vampire. In the original film, in Let the Right One In, that subplot goes on for maybe like 10-20 minutes when she goes to a friend's place and she gets attacked by cats and things like that.
She realizes she's sensitive to light and then sort of pieces together that she might be some sort of vampire and then eventually basically commits suicide via sunlight. Whereas, as you were probably mentioning, in Let Me In, it's very much just, oh crap, this is what's happening. Now she's in flames, very tight.
Yeah, one scene. So that always struck me as odd in the original film because it felt like a leftover from the fact that it is a book. The fact that that doesn't happen until like, I think an hour 20 or an hour 30 into the film, which is really weird to introduce another character to spend so much time with as well. That was a part of the adaptation from the book that I thought was a little bit weird and subsequently remedied in the new film, where in the new film, like she gets bitten, she goes straight to the hospital, and she doesn't have any crisis of conscience when she realizes what's going on with herself. She just, in a really great scene as well, when you see her in the background as the detective is talking to the boyfriend, when she starts biting into her arm, and she doesn't even commit suicide, like the nurse just comes in and opens the drapes, which is a really effective scene, not only because it's horrifying, but because it's so much more concise and effective than it was in the original movie, and I think it works. Yeah.
You brought up another difference between the two films just then. The detective.
Oh, yes! We need to talk about this guy too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he just doesn't appear in the Let the Right One In. He's a whole new, brand new... I'm not sure about it in the book, but in comparison between movies, he is effectively a brand new character.
Yeah, essentially. Adapting from the film, for sure. So, yeah, it's interesting. I see, this is another one of those changes that I think is a little bit smart too, because the other interesting thing tied into the detective is that Let Me In also starts non-linearly. It starts at the point after Hakan. I don't remember the name of the American version, but he's played by Richard Jenkins, who's great. All of his abduction scenes are excellent as well.
Oh, absolutely.
I think they're shot so incredibly well. It's really, like, tension is really fantastic in those moments. But it opens in the new film after he's burnt himself with acid and he's going to the hospital, and there's a bit of exposition over the radio, what's going on and things like that. And then it cuts back to the opening of the first film. I think that's one of those things also Americanizing the story a little bit, because it immediately starts a level of intrigue, poses a bunch of questions to the audience, to like, why did he scar himself with acid? Is he actually part of a cult? Why was he collecting blood? What is going on here?
Why did he commit suicide?
Exactly, yeah. So it's one of those things that it turns the narrative into something a little bit more classical by adding additional layer of intrigue over the top of the film to begin with, which isn't a decision I necessarily disagree with. I think it honestly works both ways. I didn't feel like I lost anything in the original film not having that opening.
I completely agree with you on that. There was, well, I do, because again, I saw Let Me In first, and so I was really sort of questioning everything, and that did draw me in. And then seeing like, all right, when maybe because I had that pretense before,
sure,
it did feel a lot slower, especially because Let the Right One In begins straight away with Oscar and him going for his full being defensive, trying to deal with school,
sure,
and his mother. And it was slow, but there was still just enough intrigue by the time that Eli came around that became the sort of focal point. So it was interesting looking at it as like an audience member. You sort of have different focal points on why you're drawn in, but it still ends up revolving around the same idea.
Yeah, exactly. It starts in slightly different positions, but it ends up at the same point.
Yes.
And I think that works really well. Yeah. So now that we've got that scene out of the way, the detective too.
Yes.
So yeah, original character for the new film. Once again, I think that ties into just sort of heightening the level of intrigue. The fact that there is a person out there actively hunting Abby and the vampires and whatever else just adds a higher level of stakes to the film. I think once again it kind of works. It also ties in really well. So the way that the detective dies in Let Me In is that he goes looking for Abby, sneaks into the apartment, and then gets killed by Abby in the bathtub. Whereas in the original film, the person who breaks into the apartment was the boyfriend of the girl who died before. So, yeah. And I think that's a change that... I mean, both of them kind of work in that they're there for similar reasons to take Abby in or, kill her or whatever else. But since the detective has basically been there from scene one, that feels like a more potent arc and scene, rather than it being a guy who was a background character for most of the film and didn't really come into prominence, and only briefly, 40 minutes before the movie ended. So, yeah.
And that also then ties in with the fact that the Victoria subplot, because again, I don't even know if she was named in the...
I think the boyfriend calls out her name when she's getting attacked, but I don't quite recall. Yep, it's a Swedish name.
Yes. So whatever, I'm just going to call her Victoria.
Yep, sure.
That subplot being cut, it would have made no sense for him to be what was essentially the main antagonist in the final climax.
Yeah.
And it also... And the fact that he was clearly out for revenge, whereas the detective was just trying to figure what the fuck was going on, almost it adds to the sort of moral ambiguity of the whole situation, I find.
Yes. That's a great segue, because moral ambiguity is the next thing I want to talk about regarding thematics. But yeah. I think you're absolutely right. I think tying the detective more prominently into the story, meaning he plays a more significant role in that scene, I think genuinely just makes the scene work better. Because it wouldn't make any sense in Let Me In if it was the boyfriend showing up, because we'd only seen him like twice. And he would have been in one conversation. We mightn't even recognize him. So yeah, I think that works really well. No, it's great. So especially regarding something I touched on in the beginning of the episode and how the new one smartly sort of adapts the thematics to an American setting. One of the things that Let Me In touches on that Let the Right One In doesn't so much is basically, the really classical notion of good versus evil. Yeah. So there's a lot of sort of allusions throughout the film. In the opening scene that we talked about, you can hear Richard Nixon's fight. I don't know the exact speech exactly, but it's like...
I don't think it was Nixon. I think it was Reagan.
Maybe it was Reagan. Yeah, but it's like the classic presidential fight against evil speech sort of thing that you can hear in the background after Hakan kills himself. And then Owen calls up his dad asking, does evil exist? Yeah. And there's a lot of more question of
touching scene.
Yeah, I think that was a really great scene and a really nice addition as well. So I think that was great.
It wasn't in the... It felt like it would have come straight from the source material. Honestly.
It may have, to be honest. That might have been something that originally came from the book. So yeah, but once again, a really great scene, and just another one of those sort of foregrounding, because obviously moral ambiguity is something that appears in the in Let the Right One In, but I just don't think it's quite as prominent as it is in Let Me In. Also the other thing with Hakan, I really don't remember the American version of the character, but let's just call him Richard Jenkins.
Okay.
How Richard Jenkins constantly comes up saying, I don't really want to do this anymore. This feels really uncomfortable and I hate killing these people. Once again, ties into that again. So I think it's obviously the whole notion of is Abby in the right? Is this is she literally insating her desire that she has to live and survive? Is she inherently evil because she has to kill these people? Obviously that's in all vampire literature, but I think Let Me In foregrounds it so much better than the original, to the point where I was noticing it all throughout. So I think it's great. Even in the title too, I don't even know if this is intentional, but changing it from Let the Right One In, which, side note, is actually based on a Morrissey song that doesn't actually have any relevance to the book or film. I listened to the song. There's one line that references I can't blame you for biting, but ultimately the song is just about letting the right people and things and influences into your life, which is kind of similar to the film. But changing it from Let the Right One In to Let Me In takes out a level of moral assertiveness. It's gone from Abby being the right one in, or the right person to let into your life, to just let me in, which basically brings up once again the notion of whether Abby should be considered sort of a positive force to Owen or an inherently negative one because of how many people she's killed. So yeah, I think that's great. I don't even know if that's intentionally why that title was chosen, but once again, I think it really just points to the fact that it was a really smart adaptation and update from the first film.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There is one downside to the whole moral ambiguity of the original. It keeps in the bullies, who are just clearly came from the dairy school of bullying.
Yeah.
Of, let's just go full psychotic.
The bullies are really stereotypical, aren't they?
Yeah.
In both films. That's kind of one thing that I wish they fixed a little bit better. I mean, they do kind of in Let Me In, isn't it? Because there's one scene, actually, when you see the bully being picked on
by his brother that comes up later.
Yeah, exactly.
Which also, really good, like, foreshadowing for that final scene, which just I didn't feel had the same impact with Let the Right One In, because there was sort of missing that, it's that bully. Although that had then its own sympathetic character in Let the Right One, it's Kennedy, right? Or something.
I think it is, yeah.
Yeah,
basically
one of his
one
friends
of the kids
being the sympathetic one, and like during the whipping scene where he's sort of...
He's pulling back and I don't want to do this is not okay. And then he gets spared in the final scene. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Comparing that to the fact that it's basically, I can't remember his name in the adaptation, but the head bully.
Oh, yeah, I don't remember. I feel like I've seen him in something, the actor, but I don't remember his name. Yeah. Either way.
Sorry. Apologies to him. He is actually quite good in this.
He's great.
He's great in the movie.
Even though it's a fairly one-note character for the most part, he does a good job with it, yeah. And he's a believable bully. I feel like I know him.
His facial expressions are really quite in tune, which I think is the one thing that saves it from being a fully one-dimensional character.
For sure.
You can sort of tell this sort of complex that he has with his older brother, which is brought in with that scene.
Yeah.
That does add a little layer of moral distinction in that, but not enough to bring it up to the same level as everything else in this film. It's
a more subtle point, but it is a good thing to bring up. Yeah, I felt similar regarding the bullies in both films, but I did kind of appreciate that slightly different touch in Let Me In. Yeah, no, it was great. Yeah, ultimately, I think this was just a genuinely fairly effective, not only faithful adaptation, but also really smart adaptation in that how it kind of altered some of the original thematics of the original book and film. So I once again, like, even talking through this, I am more impressed with this movie than when I started, which is great. Matt Reeves is awesome. I cannot wait to see what he does with Batman. It's going to be so exciting. But I mean, all this being said, I think I still prefer the original film a little bit, but I don't know if that's to do with whether it's because I saw it first, or if because, like, I think the original film has a little bit of a better atmosphere as well, and cinematography too.
Oh, okay. I see what you...
Yeah, sure.
I think that brings back to my original, very first point in this thing, that some of the production elements sort of don't lend themselves to the true, like...
It feels a little bit too stylized sometimes, I think. Yeah, not only in the lighting and in the snow and such, but just to how much more polished it is. Whereas I think the much rougher production of the original film just lends a lot more realism and authenticity to the relationship, which is ultimately why I think I find it more emotionally effective. Even if the new one I think is more thematically effective. Yeah. Which is a very interesting comparison. Yeah. No, it's great. Is there anything else you want to touch on regarding these two films, or...
Not a whole. I think we've covered quite a substantial amount.
I mean, there's not an incredible amount of differences, but the differences they make, there's a lot. It feels like there's a lot of thought behind them.
Yeah, the decisions were made were clearly. There's a lot behind why every single decision. It's very an auteurist approach.
Yeah, and
to the film.
I love that. I always admire like auteurism appearing in a blockbuster, and Matt Reeves is a perfect example of that right now. Yeah, so I think I will be watching anything else he does going forward, obviously. And I think people who haven't seen Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and War of the Planet of the Apes, I legitimately think that new trilogy, Rise, Dawn, and War, is some of the best, and most thoughtful and best presented blockbuster narratives in contemporary cinema. Yeah, I legitimately think that they deserve to be considered like a classic sci-fi trilogy going forward. So yeah, it's really great. Awesome. Cool.
So this movie has really made it hard for our Do It Differentlies.
It has, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't... Do you want to go first, or shall I?
Well, first and foremost, jingle.
Yeah, sorry.
Whatever.
Yep.
Look, I feel really bad, but I don't think there's any way I can do this differently. I racked my brain forever, but because they're so different and yet so alike, that there's nothing I can say or do that's going to really affect it without just making this way worse.
Worse, yeah. See, that's the thing. I don't know how you adapted better.
No.
It's weird, yeah.
Even differently, because they are so distinct, that it's very hard. And anything that I do is just going to end up being a pale
Imitation
of either the original or the adaptation.
Yeah.
I'm basically left it completely in the dark on this. I have nothing.
Well, okay. I mean, I don't necessarily know I have a ton of ideas, but it's just a lot of the things we talked about in regards to this. I kind of wish that it was a little bit of a less polished production. That maybe it was a little bit more rough around the edges like the original film was, because I think that would have lent, approach it more as an indie film rather than a studio horror movie, which it absolutely was. So I think that change in production would have led to just a greater level of realism and appreciation in the relationships too. I think for that same reason as well, I don't want name actors. I could have been completely unknowns in all of these roles, because one of the reasons that I don't think the relationship worked for me as well in the new one is because I knew the actors of... I've completely forgotten the boy who plays Owen's name right now, but he's Nightcrawler in the new X-Men movies, and I've seen him in whatever else. And then Chloe Grace Moretz, I've obviously seen in a bunch of stuff too. And coming in with those connotations, I think just didn't work quite as effectively. I mean, Richard Jenkins I love, and I think he's great, but I think almost anyone could have played that role just as effectively, so... Yeah, I really think it just smaller production. It doesn't... Obviously, you can still, keep it a moderately decent budget because you need to do some sort of special effects, but make it more intimate with no known actors, and then that's basically it. But even in suggesting those changes, I'm just making it more like the original film.
Yeah.
So once again, you can't really win in that respect.
I do agree with you in terms of changing the casting. Even if we don't change the casting, I feel there are some changes to do. I didn't actually know Cody Smith McPhee.
That's the one, isn't it? Who plays Owen.
Who plays Owen.
Yeah.
Bungled up that name, and it isn't even Swedish. How about that?
It's better than Author John.
I feel he'd probably still be able to keep it. So maybe some slight directorial changes, and he'd still be able to keep in the same...
Sure.
Chloe Moretz, I do feel, she probably could have been recast. Especially because... I don't know, but then you lean into that whole femininity versus sort of almost fear. Yeah. Versus predator scenario. Because we've watched in other films, Chloe Moretz really go into sort of more intense roles, looking at Carrie and even Kick-Ass in a sense.
Yeah, to some respects, yeah.
You've seen her be aggressive and intimidating, and this, she was that femininity, but at the same, that almost felt like I could have gone for something more like those roles, but at the same time that would have then detracted back from some of the other themes.
Sure.
And so you've got this real balancing act. Trying to measure it out. And I really don't know who
would be the right one
one. Even if they picked an unknown, you're still going to struggle with that balance, I feel.
Yeah, I think I would personally prefer someone more innocent and feminine in that way. I think it's just because that's kind of the direction that the thematics the new film takes, obviously. But you make a great point as well, sort of balancing that between the fact of she's completely unassuming and not a threat at all, even though she could actually rip your head off. So I think in hindsight, Chloe Grace Moretz, I don't think is a bad actress, and I don't think she puts in a bad performance or anything like that. I just think some of the connotations going into this film, especially as Hit Girl, which is foremost on my mind as this really sarcastic, sort of bombastic character, I just couldn't quite get out of my head. And I feel like I could see glimpses of it in her performance. I feel like it would have been better if I had no experience with the actress going in. So, casting an unknown, I think, would have been the way to go. But cool. Great film. Well, it made for a really interesting episode, though. As the film purist, I always get very excited when we get to talk about thematics and motifs rather than just changing plot points and characters and such. Yeah. I find this conversation genuinely more interesting.
It was really something we could sink our teeth into.
That
was meant.
How long were you sitting on that? Honestly, we're just what did you think of that halfway through the episode and just click in your brain?
Honestly, that was just then.
Oh, you lucky bastard. That's great. That's really great. I'm not going to top that. All right, let's just move it around and talk then, shall we?
Yeah. You got anything interesting?
Yeah, sure. Well, I was actually going to recommend, we referenced it briefly in this episode, but keeping in line with the idea of vampires, but I was going to talk about What We Do in the Shadows, because it is one of my favorite comedies of all time. If people haven't seen or heard of What We Do in the Shadows, it's a New Zealand film written and directed by Taika Waititi and Jermaine Clement, and basically just follows a bunch of bumbling vampires living in Auckland, just going about their daily life in mockumentary style. Not only is it absolutely hilarious, but it makes a ridiculous amount of fun of like the mythos of vampires in really delightful and ridiculous ways. And it's just, it is offbeat and it's weird, but it's also one of the funniest films I've ever seen. And it is probably my favorite depiction of vampires, even including this movie. It's great.
I do admit, watching Let Me In, and especially that scene where she's saying you have to say Let Me In, all I could think of was the nightclub scene in What We Do in the Shadows.
Yep. That's so... that really ruins the tension of the scene, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah, sure. That's such a funny comparison. I love it. Yeah, what about you? What have you got for us?
Well, I've got a third take on vampires.
Keeping things...
Yeah, keeping things on theme.
Yep.
With Daybreakers.
Oh, I don't know this one, actually.
This is an Australian-American... German co-production, I think it is. There's a few countries that got involved in this.
Interesting.
But it stars Ethan Hawke and Claudia Karvan, and a very, very interesting performance by William Dafoe.
Really? Cool.
Yeah,
okay.
Playing a good guy.
What?
He was a William Dafoe in this one.
William Dafoe. I was just about to make that joke. Damn you. Okay.
It's a joke that comes up every single time.
Yeah, I know. It's really overdone at this point.
It is a more romanticized sort of version of vampires, but not in the same way as stuff like Twilight and Interview with a Vampire.
Okay.
They are still very much the villains, but it is set in a futuristic world where vampires are the main species on Earth.
Okay, cool.
They basically have taken over. There are more vampires than there are humans, and the entire society has adapted to a vampiristic way of life.
That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it's in.
Cool.
There are, like, for example, what I really love is some of the touches they do with the ideas of a vampiric society. Like they have cars, but it's not cars with windows and mirrors because it wouldn't work that way. So instead, it's basically cars shut off and with full blinders on and cameras set up everywhere to act as mirrors and. Basically a window out and being able to see in light.
Yeah, sure. I'm looking at it right now. Guess what year it takes place in this distant, vaguely apocalyptic future.
Is it 2019?
It's 2019.
Of course it is.
That's so funny. And it came out in 2009. Yeah, sorry, continue.
Yes. So yeah, it's a really interesting, and it's again sort of dealing with a vampire and a human in a romance, but it's a bit more actiony. It's looking into it. It has a great performance by Sam Neill as this corporate vampire who's under the pretense of coming up with synthetic blood, because that's one of the main problems with the thing is because there is a lack of humans, there's a lack of blood supply.
Yeah,
and they have basically blood farms. So there's the ethical quandaries of dealing with that as well, treating humans as almost cattle, and that's running out anyway. So there's more diluted blood, and it's sending vampires from being this like very human-esque but very similar sort of vampiristic conscious to being the full
animalistic, basically.
Animalistic
Yeah,
vampires.
so the less blood they drink, the more animalistic they become.
Absolutely, and there's some real terrifying scenes dealing with those transformations.
So is it an actual like horror film per se, or
I'd say it's more sort of like a supernatural action, but not action in the same. There is those horror elements involved, and it's less action in the sense of like your diehards, and more action in the sense of almost
your Blades. I'm amazed we never referenced Blade in this whole
surprisingly.
Episode. That's weird.
But no, but the action is very much dealing with sort of moral quandaries, and the cure for vampirism is a main plot point as well. So it's sort of a mixture of action, political thriller, a bit of romance, a bit of drama.
Cool.
So a nice blend.
Yeah, okay. It sounds like a really interesting premise. I might have to give that one a watch. Cool. What'd you say it was called again?
Daybreakers.
Daybreakers. Yep. Awesome. Well, thank you to everyone who listened to this episode of
Well,
Medium.
it did feel a bit like a lesson. We're very...
Well, yeah, sure. But yeah, if you want to contact us, feel free to email us at mediumshift@gmail.com. Feel free to rate us on whatever podcasting platform you prefer, or recommend us to friends or whatever else. It's really the only way we can get the word out, because obviously we have a limited amount of friends that we can force this podcast down the throats of.
I'm already losing so many.
Yeah, it's just a downward spiral from here. So yeah, in next episode we are going to be doing our first play adaptation, which I'm actually very excited about, regarding a cross.
We're doing the Crucible.
Haha, see, I brought it back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even though there aren't really too many crosses in the Crucible.
Shut up. You know, I was trying for something, all right? Okay, until next time, fare thee well.
Burn the witch.